Hi everyone, welcome back to season 4 of the How to Do It video series. And we're here at Nutrition Farms, our Sunshine Coast farm, and we're up on the veranda here in the cool winter evening, and hopefully the light will hold out for some of the presentations we're intending to do in the next couple of hours. Now, the idea of the How to Do It series is quite simply we're trying to give you the practical skills to address certain problems on the farm. And a very common problem, something that we address on a daily basis with soil tests and grower reports around the world, is the simple idea of salinity and high sodium soils and how do you manage them best. Now, the starting point, there are a variety of root causes of that high sodium scenario, but we're going to get right down to what you can do to the plant to get through that scenario. But first of all, we'll get back to the root causes. And the root causes can include a whole variety of things, including saline irrigation water, the fact that we've torn up a lot of the trees and lifted the salt table so it can be coming up from below. But very commonly it can be linked to a closed, tight soil that retains sodium, and so it can't leach. It's a very leachable trace mineral or major mineral, sodium. And we're talking about, the Cal-Mag ratio. We're talking about high magnesium soils where we'll very commonly see this tight, closed soil with high magnesium that also has high sodium. And so the balancing mechanism from a mineral perspective is that we look at whatever's missing, which of course is going to be calcium very commonly. And then we look at, can we use calcium carbonate and have this displacement effect of both sodium and magnesium? And can we also use a combination often of some gypsum, because that calcium sulfate, when it ionizes and breaks apart in the soil, becomes sodium sulfate or magnesium sulfate, both of which are very, very leachable. And so we can use a dual purpose strategy. The lime at 40% calcium, so it's the highest source of calcium, the calcium carbonate, to displace both magnesium and sodium and improve the balance and open the soil in that manner. Of course, calcium creates flocculation, pushes apart the clay particles, and allows the soil to breathe so much better. But in the process, it can displace magnesium and sodium. So we mentioned, so we've got that strength with the liming, and then the gypsum component, that involves, of course, leaching out as sodium sulfate or magnesium sulfate. And so that's sort of the sort of strategy that we might look at. But the bottom line is sometimes you've got what you've got, and it can be a lengthy process to change that. So how do you address, what are some strategies to address and get through and still get a good crop in excess sodium scenario? Now, number one, we'll talk about some supplements, as you could call them, that we could bring into the story. And one of them is potassium silicate, the wonderfully versatile soluble form of silica called potassium silicate. And there are several papers that have confirmed that potassium silicate, or the soluble form of silica, can block the transport of sodium ions into the plant. And the potassium content can help a little bit, as people think they're using a potassium fertilizer, but they're only using small amounts, and it shouldn't really be classified as potassium source, as a major potassium source, although there's a little bit there, and that might help. And that can sort of help a little bit to counter the sodium-based antagonism of potassium uptake. Remembering that simple little scenario that when we talk about base saturation, the saturation of the bases, the most abundant cations are called bases, and their saturation on the clay colloid. And we mentioned the scenario that we never ever want to see a higher percentage of sodium versus potassium, because they're the same size ion, and the plant decides it wants some potassium, and it always takes the ones that there's most of, because there's always been more potassium in the natural scheme of things until we stepped in and messed it up, and the plant essentially hasn't caught up with our mismanagement. So if there's two ions the same size and there's more of one than the other, the plant will take sodium and you will not be getting your potassium, and you will be getting some signs of sodium toxicity. So one of the simple strategies is that we want to bring some potassium in and at least lift it higher than sodium. But there are soils where that's simply not possible. There's so much sodium, there can be 8 and 9 and 7%, and we don't want potassium that high because then it shuts down other minerals. So now we've got to say, how can we manage? So how can we get rid of some of that sodium, and how can we manage a crop and produce a crop in those high sodium scenarios? So we mentioned silica blocks the transport of sodium ions, but there's also this other bunch of research, 2 or 3 papers, that have demonstrated that silica can actually boost basically the strengthening of the antioxidants. Because what happens basically with high sodium is you get this oxidative stress that salinity creates, and the plant struggles demonstrably. And basically, antioxidants can counter that oxidative stress, and there's this good research showing that silica boosts that antioxidant machinery to give you that inherent protection. So how much would you use? Well, if you're in a broadacre scenario, you can't use much because it burns, it's quite hot. But there's recorded responses, and good responses, with as little as, you're using 100 litres per hectare for argument's sake, you're going to use 400 mils of potassium silicate per 100 litres. And that, of course, that'll have a secondary effect. Other than giving you more sodium resistance, it also boosts cell strength and it boosts plant immunity. We understand now that silica is a major immune elicitor, which also boosts yield, because everything that boosts immunity boosts yield. So it's a nice end outcome with multiple benefits. If we were in it's like an orchard scenario, we're using maybe 1,000 or 1,500 litres per hectare, we would use a couple of litres, maybe 3 litres at the max of potassium silicate in that scenario. In vegetable crops, maybe 2 litres per hectare. Just 100 to 200 mils per 100 litres is the minimum amount that you can get a response with. But I like to lose a little more when we can, when we're using higher water rates. So the second components, or supplements we could call them, that can help increase resistance to salinity generally, basically are those 2 very famous natural acids called humic acid and fulvic acid. And again, there's significant studies. There's a study by Kaya et al. From 2018, which demonstrates that both humic and fulvic acid are capable of basically, even just applied as a seed treatment, but liquid injected or fertigated, very, very effective in countering the negatives associated with high sodium. So what kind of amounts would you use? Well, I'll be looking at maybe 400 grams. We're talking humic and fulvic, and we're talking about a new product, relatively new for Nutritech, which we'll mention at this point. Of course, this is our product Fulvex, that is a combination of half fulvic and half humic. And what's unique about it is that the humic component is compatible with everything. And that's not been possible before, because humic drops out with anything that's acidic, which is almost everything in modern agriculture. So here's one that you can put with anything. So we're going to use this combination of humic and fulvic to counter high sodium in this scenario. So how much would you use? I would use 400 grams of Fulvex per hectare if I was liquid injecting, which is a good strategy, right into the root zone at planting and Broadacre. I would use 200 grams in that 100 litres of water as part of the recipe if we're foliar spraying in Broadacre. And in an orchard scenario, I'd fertigate maybe 1 kilo of this stuff per hectare, and I'd foliar spray with about 400 grams of Fulvex per hectare. Of course, Humates offer much more than sodium management. We've talked about it many times before, this increased uptake, this thing called cell sensitization, where the cell membrane becomes more permeable and you absorb 30 to 34% more of whatever you put it with. In this case, we're utilising it. We might combine it with our potassium silicate because it is compatible, and further increase the uptake and utilisation of the silica aside from the benefits, the sodium management benefits associated with the humates. So we've got natural chelation. Both humic and fulvic can chelate. We've got this auxin-like hormone response, which gives you this leaf and root stimulation. And of course, you're feeding both beneficial fungi and you're feeding bacteria when you apply humic, which feeds fungi, and fulvic, which feeds bacteria. So that's a nice little model. Now, the third component, in terms of, and we're going to give you a recipe shortly, but the third component is, of course, the wonderful thing called seaweed or kelp. Now, there's a really nice study published from a guy who actually comes from the University of Queensland working with some people in the Middle East, and his name's Aladi Galal Etanahi, and basically from the University of Queensland, really nice study that showed that just a seed treatment, and seed treatments are nothing, like a couple of dollars or less per hectare, a seed treatment with kelp, but just a seed treatment in quite saline conditions in the Middle East provided a full season salinity tolerance because the seaweed and the hormones and the various components, the many components found in that plant from the ocean, basically gifted this enhanced antioxidant effect to counter the free radical damage associated with salinity. We all know about kelp as being the rescue remedy for those same reasons, that you've got stress of any kind, abiotic or biotic stress, and then kelp becomes the great rescue remedy. We've seen studies that have linked the cytokinins and gibberellins found in kelp directly to salinity stress, but it's thought that there's some secondary metabolites involved that we've perhaps yet to identify. There's just no doubt that it gives some kind of impact against salinity. So we've got 2 or 3 things here, and the fourth and final component, and then we'll talk about a recipe, is that substance that I'm so fond of. It's, as I've mentioned previously, I've formulated most of our products, and this ingredient, which is in several of our products, is amongst the most powerful of the many, many things that I've worked with over the years. And we're talking about a substance called Triacontanol. Now, this is a fatty acid that was discovered in the early 80s, late 70s, and it's extracted from the outer waxy coating of the lucerne plant. And at tiny amounts, 30, 50 mils per hectare, it can give this wonderful response that's based largely upon boosting every aspect of photosynthesis. So you can measure with a chlorophyll meter this substantial increase in chlorophyll density. So you got more sugar factories, basically. You can measure increases in CO2 uptake. So you're affecting stomatal opening and you're getting more efficient. And then we look at all the phosphate-based enzymes that make sugar, and they all work more efficiently. And the list goes on. You get more flowers, you get a healthier plant, you get, amongst the many benefits, you get this reduced salinity stress. And so we look, for example, at some Middle Eastern researchers called Islam, Zaid, and Muhammad, and they published a paper called The Role of Triacontanol and Counteracting the Ill Effects of Salinity in Plants, a review. And so they basically went through and looked at all the research. And I suggest you have a look at that paper because it really is quite impressive what they discovered about this natural substance that alleviated the negatives associated with salinity, but also increased plant growth and resilience and productivity and flowering and fruit-to-flower ratio and all of the wonderful things that Triacontanol can bring to the party. Now, we'll just talk about our versions of these various things. This is Nutristim Triacontanol. This is one of the more concentrated forms and one of the least expensive forms of Triacontanol in the world, and it is quite special. We struggle to keep up with the demand for it. This is our potassium silicate, of course, the small bottle that comes in 200 litre or 1,000 litre containers, depending on how much you need and what scale you're on. This is our water-soluble silica. This is the wonderful Fulvex, this 50% soluble, it's a powder, soluble humic acid, and 50%, or roughly 47% soluble fulvic acid powder. So half and half fulvic and humic that's compatible with everything. And of course, this is our largest selling product in the world, this one here, which of course is Trikelp, this combination of 3 varieties of kelp that we can pretty much guarantee will outperform, because of a synergistic combination of these 3, that it will outperform any other kelp anywhere in the world. And it does. That's why it's such a big seller globally. So that's Trikelp. And let's look now at how, and all of these things have got their benefits. Of course, Trikelp's 74 minerals from the ocean. It's got very high levels of all 4 of the hormones that drive every aspect of plant growth, the cytokinins, the gibberellins, auxins, and betaines. And not just plant growth, but even post-harvest shelf life is impacted by 3 of those 4 hormones. So kelp is sort of an essential in this regenerative approach. And that's Trikelp, the most special of the kelps that's available out there. And we'll talk now about a salinity recipe. So I'm going to give you a super cost-effective Broadacre recipe, and you can scale that up a bit when you've got more water involved. But we're talking about 400 mils of potassium silicate. So this is in 100 litres, which is the standard kind of Broadacre rate, and it's even dropping lower than that now as people are discovering the benefit of the 50-litre drones, and many, many of my growers that I consult with globally are now adopting drones for foliar spraying with some really nice results, and they're usually utilising about 60 litres of water per hectare, delivered very, very efficiently with the drone pumping that fine mist and smothering both sides of the leaf with the pressure of the air that it's driving it in. So we're talking 400 mils of potassium silicate, 200 grams of Fulvex, 400 mils of this stuff, 200 grams of Fulvex, 30 mils is not much of Nutristim Triacontanol per hectare, that's about $2 worth, and 100 grams of the soluble seaweed powder per 100 litres, 1 gram per litre. So it's probably $10, $12 per hectare max in Australia. It may be more expensive elsewhere, and you get all those other benefits of those particular ingredients. Now, the other sort of impact, and we'll just talk about that for a moment, the other yield impact of excess sodium relates to its negative effect, as we mentioned, upon potassium. So how can we bypass that if we can't afford to fix the potassium, lift it higher on base saturation than sodium? That's where foliar comes in. And I'm going to talk, we've got potassium fertilizer, but I'm talking about a simple ingredient that is so invaluable and so rarely used. And we're talking potassium sulfate, which is not popular because you can only get 10 kilos in 100 litres versus 1 kilo in 1 litre, or 10 kilos in 10 litres if you're talking urea, for example. So we're talking 8 kilos per hectare in 100 litres of water dissolves nicely. And we'd add a little bit of Fulvex to that. And that gives us the potassium hit. It's 41% potassium and potassium sulfate 42%, and that's a nice dose. And the sulfur that comes with it. I mean, so many soils are lacking sulfur, so a really nice potassium response at 8 kilos per hectare, and that could be higher when you've got higher water rates. So we might use 15 kilos per hectare in a potassium deficient orchard scenario as a foliar. And again, we're going to use a little bit more Fulvex in that scenario, but in Broadacre, 8 kilos of potassium sulfate and 200 grams of Fulvex to collate and magnify the potassium and sulfur response. So let's look at one of the other side effects that we will just touch upon with the high pH that very often comes with the high magnesium and sodium, because they're often combined, but even the high sodium will lift pH because it's a very alkalizing mineral. And so what happens if we look at a pH chart and what happens in varying pH levels is that if we're up in the sort of 8s, which is quite common in a high sodium soil, then we've actually impacted all 5 of the trace minerals. And so again, we have products like Shuttle 7 and a few other products that contain all of those trace minerals and a couple of others with cobalt and molybdenum included. And you could use something like that. But if you wanted to do it yourself, the kind of rates you might use, say 500 grams of soluble, 500 grams of copper sulfate, 500 grams of iron sulfate, a kilo of zinc sulfate, a kilo of manganese sulfate. This is per hectare. Now you're going to use a little bit of Fulvex to collate them and magnify them, about 300 grams. This is all in 100 litres of water, 300 grams of Fulvex to collate and magnify those minerals. And you could combine that with your potassium sulfate if you needed potassium at that point, or it might be with the urea foliar spray. You might have 10 or 12 kilos of urea that, again, is going to be buffered and magnified with the Fulvex. So that's the kind of recipe. We mentioned half a kilo of soluble, half a kilo of copper sulfate, half a kilo of iron sulfate, a kilo of zinc and a kilo of manganese, 300 grams of Fulvex in 100 litres of water. And that works really nicely in a high pH soil to counter both sodium, in this case to counter the effects of sodium, the alkalizing shutdown of those 5 trace minerals. So that's a couple of ideas for you for high sodium soils. Now, there's just one other thing that can be fertigated, foliar sprayed or liquid injected, and this is the concept of, we all know about gypsum. I've mentioned the idea of gypsum. This calcium sulfate that breaks apart and forms sodium sulfate, or magnesium sulfate, and leaches those excesses out of your soil. But you can do that in the root zone even more effectively by using micronized, 5 micron micronised gypsum, and in our case it's called GypLife, and it's a very popular product for obvious reasons. That can be liquid injected or it can be fertigated, and you're really just managing, if you can't afford to put gypsum over the whole property, you're just managing that tiny little area from the root called the rhizosphere, where all the action's happening, where that plant's trying to breathe the best it can, and you've opened that up and you've pulled out some of the excess sodium and reduced. And because humic acid can have that nice effect, it's a nice combination to include some humic acid. So we would use our soluble humate granules and make your own humic acid at 1 to 10. That's called the DIY humic acid. So we'd use humic acid and gypsum together to further neutralise the effect of sodium in the root zones. So I hope there's something there that could be of value if you're struggling with high sodium soils and plants affected by that sodium. Thanks for listening.